I want to take you to the beginning of Edward Bernays. He is deemed the father of modern public relations, but a lot of people, because he wrote a book in 1928 called Propaganda, assume he was evil. But let's start by how the outside world views PR's origins.
There's no denying the importance of this multi-billion-dollar industry, but what exactly is it? How does it work? And who invented it? Here's where it gets crazy. The art of modern public relations can be generally traced to one man, Edward Bernays. There were other earlier innovators, but none altered the social landscape of North America as profoundly. Born in Vienna, Austria in 1891, Bernays' family moved to New York City about a year after his birth. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and like his uncle, Bernays was captivated by the convoluted processes of the human mind. Bernays often consulted his uncle's work, and he was the first to incorporate psychology and other social sciences into PR. Yet where Freud sought to uncover motivations, Bernays sought to mask them, and Bernays' clients were companies rather than individuals. For example, one of his early cases involved Lucky Strike cigarettes in the 1920s. The American Tobacco Company asked him to expand sales. Women would be an ideal market, but there were problems. First, women didn't care for the green packaging of Lucky Strikes, and the manufacturer concluded that changing the color was too expensive. Second, it was taboo for women to smoke in public. Bernays took a unique approach to these obstacles. First, he recommended that if the packs must stay green, they should make green the premier color of the fashion season. During his Green Ball campaign, Bernays convinced French designers to incorporate green into their latest fashion lines, and not just any green, but the specific dark green shade of Lucky Strike packaging. He also engineered a green gala at the Waldorf Astoria, featuring some of society's most prominent tastemakers. To address the problem of smoking in public, he linked Lucky Strike cigarettes to the women's liberation movement, arranging for young women to march down Fifth Avenue, smoking and calling the cigarettes torches of freedom. Instead of appearing to sell cigarettes, this seemingly spontaneous march appeared to be a part of the struggle for gender equality. Suddenly, Lucky Strike cigarettes didn't just have packaging that matched the latest Parisian fashions, they also made a statement about women's equality. It's easy to see how these associations could skew market opinion, and the campaign was enormously successful. If you're like most people, then you probably assume that you know where your opinions come from. And if you're like most people, you're probably wrong. Humans tend to think of each belief as the result of a rational analysis, but this is not entirely true. Instead, our opinions are subtly influenced in numerous ways, and we're often not aware of this process. Edward Bernays tapped into this phenomenon to increase the sales of hairnets, cigarettes, bacon, and more, but that's just the beginning.
Now, I know some of you might be feeling a little creeped out and thinking how you might describe the roots of PR to friends and family when they ask you what you're doing. And others probably thought, so cool, I can't believe he connected all those dots and did bacon and hairnets? How did he do that, right? So let me tell you a little bit about Edward Bernays and this that was actually, first of all, everything in context. When he did this, there were no health contraindications for cigarette smoking. In fact, doctors did testimonials for cigarettes. So you have to put it in context that in the 1960s, Edward Bernays became a hugely outspoken anti-tobacco guy. So everything in context, first of all. And yet, the perception of PR kind of hasn't moved on. But the torches of freedom idea tapped into this notion of, remember, women's vote, the suffragettes movement, the women's liberation movement, which actually started in the 1800s but became most famous in the 20s and 30s. And so he tied that together. But here's the influencer side of it that was pretty fascinating.
So I called up a debutante friend of mine, asked her to get another friend and two young men whom they liked. And I also instructed them on how to give information about what they did to the newsreels, weekly newsreels, to the newspapers, to the three important press associations, the AP, the United Press, and International News Service, and to walk from 34th Street to 57th and back and forth, lighting torches of freedom to protest man's inhumanity to women by a taboo against smoking. Next morning, there wasn't a newspaper in the United States, even the New York Times had a front page story, "Debutantes light torches of freedom to protest man's inhumanity to women by a taboo against smoking."
And this is what he did. On the far left is Narcissa Vanderlip, wife of Frank Vanderlip, who was one of the most influential business people in New York at this time. In fact, there she is. Can you identify who that is on the right? First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. So he thought, well, how do I make green, and remember his mission was making green really popular as part of his mission for Lucky Strike, and he thought, well, what if I got the most influential woman in New York to host a green ball at the Waldorf Astoria? Well, she wasn't particularly allied with cigarettes, so that was kind of a tough ask. So he then figured out that Narcissa Vanderlip, her number one mission in life was the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, a top-flight hospital. So he thought, well, what if we donated all the money from the green ball to your cause? Would you host that green ball at the Waldorf? She said, sure. Simultaneously, he went to the fashion editors, talked about the green ball, and converged the whole world for a brief period, because green has not been a very fashionable color for many years. But that year, green was enormous. So it was kind of brilliant what he did, but he depended upon his notion of influencers, right? Narcissa Vanderlip, he started by saying he hired debutantes to walk into the parade, his notion of influencers. Well, in propaganda, he wrote, in almost every act of our daily lives, whether the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct, ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And again, under the term propaganda may creep you out, but how many of you do influencer mapping now? Right? That's not creepy. It's not. You do influencer mapping, you do influencer engagement. It's the few who are amplifying out and influencing the others, right? Well, just to show you that he also went beyond propaganda, I won't read all this, but you should. Crystallizing Public Opinion is a really interesting work. And if I take you now to what he thinks PR does.
Many people believe public relations is press agentry, flackery, publicity. Public relations is not that. It is a two-way street, advising the client on attitudes and actions to win over the public on whom viability of the unit depends, and then educating, informing, and persuading the public to accept these social goods, ideas, concepts, or whatever.
He believed it was about dialogue and understanding your publics. Now, flash forward to 1955, a seminal piece of work by these two, Lazarsfeld and Katz, and you're about to see Elihu Katz, the student of Paul Lazarsfeld, who came up with the term key opinion leader for the first time. This entire piece was based on an enormous piece of research, all women, run by women, about women, in Decatur. Here's a little bit of background.
How do people make up their minds? How do we decide what to buy, what movies to watch, what politicians to vote for? Do we rely on messages from the media, or do we turn to family and friends? These were questions explored by a group of American sociologists in the mid-1940s when they examined the consumer choices of 800 Midwestern women. Their work would result in one of the most influential mass communication books of the 20th century. This book was Personal Influence, and it almost didn't happen at all.
a sample of women in Decatur, Illinois, in the areas of consumer buying, coffee, stuff like that, fashion. Have you changed your hat style lately? Movie going, how did you decide to go to this movie rather than some other movie? The People's Choice produced the idea that in the process of decision making, people turn not so much or not very effectively to the mass media, but more effectively to other people. They called them opinion leaders, but they didn't mean, leaders. They meant small L leaders, like my brother-in-law, who told me how to vote.
So theoretically speaking, personal influence solidified the two-step flow theory of mass communication. The idea that media messages flow first to opinion leaders and then from opinion leaders to the people around them.
And then came the book by Ed Keller and John Barry, The Influentials. 1 American in 10 tells the other 9 how to vote, where to eat, what to buy. They are the influentials. So this whole notion keeps building on itself. You can see it started with the idea from propaganda and builds and builds and builds, that if we could just identify and enlist the influentials, we can be very effective in amplifying and getting our message through and actually converting the way other people think and behave, right? Well, Malcolm Gladwell said, yeah, that's right. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point called it the law of the few, and he said you need connectors, mavens, and salesmen. And again, back to the same principle, that a few people kind of trigger everything else for the rest of us. Well, then along came Duncan Watts. He said that maybe Tipping Point is toast, as Fast Company wrote up this article. Maybe Malcolm Gladwell got it wrong. Maybe we're behind in times, perhaps, in understanding the dynamics of influence in social networks.
And part of the condition that allows what we think of as a social epidemic to occur is lots of easily influenced people influencing other easily influenced people, right? So this is sort of hard to put on a bumper sticker, but I think that's actually closer to the truth, that you have to get these long chains of susceptible people who are able to influence each other. So that's why it doesn't really matter so much who starts it, because when you have this critical mass of people who can be influenced and also influence each other, that's the equivalent of the dry underbrush. And so when we see one of these large events happen, we instinctively go to the source and think, oh, that person did something and then lots of other people did it, they must be super influential. But in fact, that may not be the case. Don't forget about the mass media. I mean, it's striking that in Edward Bernays, he emphasized the influences, but it was the media coverage of the influences that actually drove all the change. So I think, we have this concept that we call big seed marketing, which is you don't start with the small seed. You don't try to find the influencer. You start with a very large seed of ordinary people who you get through whatever paid media campaign you have, and then you try to optimize the amount of additional sharing you get from your big seed, right? So you can't get things to go viral, but if you start with a large seed, even as it dies out, it accumulates more, it does spread, right? And so I think that going from something that dies out rapidly to something that dies out less rapidly doesn't sound like a very exciting thing to do, but that's actually the key.
What's the one smartest thing they should take away from this to be able to apply?
I think the point that we've been struck with over and over again is that the media never went away, right? Mm-hmm. That we went through this decades-long phase where we thought, nobody pays attention to the mass media, it's all about personal influence. That was just never right? That was just sort of, we discovered this new toy and we're playing with the new toy, but the old thing is still there. And even with fragmentation of channels over the last couple of decades, even with the internet, the broadcast node is still the thing that is driving attention.